The rain hammered against the windows of the old manor house as Thomas Whitmore sat alone in his study, staring at the yellowed letter in his trembling hands. After 43 years of loyal service to the crown, the former Royal Guard captain had carried this burden long enough. The Queen had been dead for 6 months now, and the weight of the secret was crushing him. Thomas remembered the night like it was yesterday, though it happened 28 years ago. He was a young guardsman then, assigned to the night shift at one of the Queen's private residences. The autumn wind had been howling that evening when he heard the soft crying coming from the Queen's private chambers. His duty was to protect, not to pry, but something about those muffled sobs made him pause outside the door. Through the crack beneath the door, he could see shadows moving in the candlelight. The Queen was speaking in hushed tones to someone, her voice breaking with emotion. Thomas knew he should walk away, but his feet remained planted. Then he heard words that would haunt him forever. "My son, my precious boy. I wish things could be different." The next morning, Thomas was reassigned to a different post without explanation. A new family had moved into a cottage on the royal estate grounds. A humble gardener and his wife, along with a baby boy they claimed was their own. The child had the most striking blue eyes Thomas had ever seen, eyes that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place at the time. Years passed, and Thomas watched the boy grow from a distance. The gardener's son, as everyone knew him, was different from other children. He carried himself with an unusual grace, spoke with remarkable intelligence, and had an uncanny way of understanding people. The royal staff seemed drawn to him, though none could explain why. Thomas began to notice things others missed. The way the Queen's eyes lingered on the boy during her walks through the gardens, how she always found reasons to visit that particular section of the estate. The subtle gifts that appeared at the cottage, expensive books, fine clothes that somehow fit perfectly, educational opportunities that seemed beyond a gardener's means. The boy excelled in everything he touched. His teachers marveled at his quick mind and natural leadership abilities. He learned languages effortlessly, understood complex political discussions that shouldn't have interested a child his age, and displayed a sense of duty and honor that seemed bred into his very bones. As Thomas rose through the ranks of the Royal Guard, his access to information increased. He discovered medical records that didn't quite add up, travel logs that showed gaps in the Queen's schedule during certain periods, and most telling of all, a series of private meetings between the Queen and a renowned physician, known for his discretion in matters of royal health. The puzzle pieces slowly formed a picture that Thomas desperately wanted to ignore. The timing of the boy's arrival, the Queen's protective interest in him, the resources quietly directed toward his education and welfare. It all pointed to a truth that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. When the boy turned 18, Thomas watched from afar as he left the estate to attend university. The Queen personally saw him off, though she maintained the pretense of simply bidding farewell to a favored staff member's son. Thomas noticed the tears in her eyes and the way her hands shook as she waved goodbye. The young man returned during holidays, each visit marking his continued growth into someone remarkable. He had inherited not just intelligence and grace, but also the Queen's sense of justice and deep compassion for others. Thomas found himself wondering what kind of king such a man might make, then immediately pushed such dangerous thoughts away. Now, sitting in his study with the letter that could change everything, Thomas faced an impossible decision. The Queen had trusted him with her secret, even if she never spoke it aloud. She had relied on his loyalty and discretion to protect both her reputation and her son's safety. But she was gone now, and the young man, now 28 years old, lived his life believing he was nothing more than a gardener's son. Thomas had discovered the truth through years of careful observation and deduction, but recently he had found something that removed all doubt. Hidden in the Queen's private papers, which he had been asked to sort after her death, was a letter in her own handwriting. It was addressed to her son, explaining everything: his true parentage, the reasons for the secrecy, and her love for him that could never be publicly acknowledged. The letter was never sent, but its existence confirmed what Thomas had long suspected. The Queen had died without ever telling her son who he really was, leaving Thomas as perhaps the only person alive who knew the complete truth. The weight of this knowledge was becoming unbearable, especially as he watched the young man continue his modest life, unaware of his royal blood and the throne that might rightfully be his. Thomas closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the events that had led him to this moment of revelation. The investigation had begun innocently enough when he was tasked with organizing the Queen's personal effects. As her most trusted guard, he had been given access to documents and belongings that few others had ever seen. Among the Queen's private papers, Thomas discovered a medical file that made his blood run cold. It detailed a pregnancy that the Queen had hidden from the world 28 years ago. The dates matched perfectly with the mysterious appearance of the gardener's son on the estate. The file contained ultrasound images, medical notes about the Queen's condition, and most shocking of all, a birth certificate that had never been filed with any official registry. The father's name on the document was someone Thomas recognized, a foreign diplomat who had visited the court frequently during that period. The man had died in a car accident shortly after the child's birth, taking his part of the secret to the grave. The Queen had been left alone to protect both her crown and her child from a scandal that could have destroyed the monarchy. Thomas remembered the diplomat well. He had been intelligent, charming, and deeply committed to humanitarian causes. The man had captured the Queen's heart during a vulnerable period in her life, when her marriage was troubled and her duties felt overwhelming. Their relationship had been brief but intense, conducted in absolute secrecy to protect both their positions. The medical records revealed the elaborate plan the Queen had devised to hide her pregnancy. She had spent the final months at a remote royal residence claiming to be recovering from a minor illness. Only a handful of trusted staff knew the truth, and they had all signed strict confidentiality agreements. The birth had been attended by a single doctor who had since passed away, taking his oath of silence with him to the grave. After the birth, the Queen had made the most difficult decision of her life. She could not raise the child as her own without destroying the stability of the monarchy and causing a constitutional crisis. Instead, she arranged for him to be placed with the estate's head gardener and his wife, a couple who had been trying unsuccessfully to have children for years. The gardener and his wife believed they were simply helping the Queen by caring for an orphaned child of unknown parentage. They never suspected they were raising a prince. The Queen provided for the child's needs through carefully disguised channels, ensuring he received the best education and opportunities while maintaining the fiction that he was their biological son. Thomas discovered financial records showing regular payments to various educational institutions and private tutors, all arranged through intermediaries who couldn't trace the funding back to the Queen. She had watched her son grow from a distance, celebrating his achievements in private while maintaining her public role as the childless monarch devoted to her country. The boy's adoptive parents had given him the name David Gardner, choosing a surname that honored their profession while giving no hint of his true identity. David had grown up believing himself to be their son, though he sometimes wondered about his unusual interests and abilities that seemed to set him apart from his peers. As Thomas delved deeper into the Queen's private correspondence, he found letters she had written but never sent to David. In them, she poured out her heart about the love she felt for him and the pain of being unable to acknowledge him publicly. She wrote about watching him from her window as he played in the gardens, about the pride she felt when he excelled in his studies, and about the dreams she had for his future. One letter particularly moved Thomas to tears. In it, the Queen described a day when young David had fallen and scraped his knee in the palace gardens. She had watched from her window as his adoptive mother comforted him, longing to rush down and hold him herself. She wrote about the physical pain she felt from being unable to be a real mother to her child. The Queen had also documented her careful efforts to ensure David's character development. She had arranged for him to volunteer at charities, to travel and see different parts of the world, and to understand the responsibilities that came with privilege. Without knowing it, David had been receiving a royal education in service and leadership. Thomas found evidence that the Queen had been secretly proud of every one of David's accomplishments. When he graduated university with honors, she had quietly celebrated alone in her private chambers. When he started working for an international aid organization, she had followed his career with the dedication of any loving mother, even arranging for additional funding to reach the programs he supported. The most heartbreaking discovery was a series of photographs the Queen had kept hidden in a secret compartment of her desk. They showed David at various stages of his life, as a toddler playing in the gardens, as a schoolboy receiving academic awards, as a young man graduating from university. She had somehow managed to obtain these pictures without anyone suspecting her deep personal interest in the gardener's son. Thomas realized that the Queen had lived with this secret for nearly 3 decades, watching her son from afar and loving him in silence. The burden had shaped her entire reign, influencing her policies on family welfare and children's rights. Her famous compassion for single mothers and orphaned children took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of her own hidden experience. The weight of discovery pressed heavily on Thomas as he realized the full scope of what he had uncovered. David Gardner was not just any hidden royal child. He was the Queen's only biological offspring, making him the rightful heir to the throne. The implications were staggering, and Thomas found himself caught between loyalty to his deceased queen and a growing sense that David deserved to know his true identity. Thomas began to observe David more closely during his visits to the estate. Now 28 years old, David worked as a humanitarian coordinator for an international relief organization. He lived simply in a small apartment in the city, dedicating his life to helping refugees and displaced families around the world. His compassion and natural leadership abilities had earned him respect among his colleagues, though he remained humble about his achievements. During one of David's visits to see his adoptive parents, Thomas watched him interact with the estate staff. There was something magnetic about the young man's presence. People naturally gravitated toward him, seeking his opinion on matters both trivial and important. He listened with genuine interest to everyone who spoke with him, from the youngest kitchen assistant to the eldest groundskeeper. Thomas noticed how David moved through the estate with an unconscious familiarity that went beyond childhood memories. He seemed to understand the rhythms and protocols of royal life intuitively, adapting his behavior naturally to the formal environment while maintaining his warm, approachable demeanor. It was as if royal blood truly did carry with it an innate understanding of palace life. The resemblance to the Queen became more apparent as David matured. He had inherited her thoughtful expression, her graceful bearing, and most tellingly, her distinctive blue eyes that seemed to see straight into people's souls. His hands, when he gestured while speaking, moved with the same elegant precision that had characterized the Queen's public appearances. Thomas discovered that David had been asking questions about his background more frequently in recent years. His adoptive parents had always been vague about his origins, telling him only that he had come to them as a baby through unofficial channels. David had accepted this explanation as a child, but as an adult, he was beginning to wonder about his biological family and medical history. The gardener and his wife had raised David with love and honesty in all things except this one crucial detail. They had been sworn to secrecy by the Queen herself, promised that revealing the truth would put David in danger. They believed they were protecting him by maintaining the fiction of his ordinary birth, never realizing that their silence was keeping him from his birthright. Thomas learned that David had recently considered hiring a private investigator to research his background. The young man was planning to start a family of his own and wanted to know about potential hereditary health conditions. He had no idea that his medical history was documented in the most secure files of the Royal Medical Service. The current heir to the throne was the Queen's nephew, a man whose scandals and questionable judgment had made him increasingly unpopular with both the public and Parliament. Thomas couldn't help but contrast this heir's behavior with David's exemplary character and dedicated service to others. The irony was profound. The man who would make the better king was living in obscurity, while the lesser candidate prepared to inherit the crown. Thomas began to research the legal implications of his discovery. The laws of succession were complex, but the documentation he had found appeared to establish David's legitimate claim to the throne. The Queen's marriage at the time of David's conception had been troubled but still legally valid, which could complicate matters. However, the birth certificate and DNA evidence that could be obtained would likely prove David's parentage beyond doubt. The political ramifications were enormous. Revealing David's identity would create a constitutional crisis that could reshape the monarchy. Parliament would be forced to address questions of succession that hadn't been raised in centuries. The public reaction would be unpredictable, ranging from outrage over the deception to fascination. with the romantic story of the hidden prince. Thomas also considered the personal cost to David. The young man had built a meaningful life dedicated to helping others. Revealing his royal identity would destroy his privacy and force him into a role he had never sought. He would face intense scrutiny from the media and pressure to abandon the humanitarian work that gave his life purpose. Yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that David had a right to know who he really was. The Queen's final letter, found among her most private papers, expressed her regret at never telling David the truth. She had planned to reveal everything when she felt the time was right, but her unexpected death had prevented that conversation from ever taking place. As Thomas wrestled with his decision, he began to document everything he had discovered. He carefully photocopied the relevant documents, organized the evidence chronologically, and prepared a comprehensive file that told the complete story of David's true parentage. He stored copies in multiple secure locations, knowing that such explosive information needed to be protected. The burden of knowledge was affecting Thomas's health. He had lost weight and struggled with insomnia as he debated what action to take. His wife noticed his distress but couldn't understand its source, as Thomas felt bound by his oath of secrecy even from her. He found himself studying David during every interaction, looking for signs of the greatness that seemed to run in his bloodline. Thomas made his decision on a gray morning in late November. He had spent weeks agonizing over the right course of action, but a news report about the current heir's latest scandal finally pushed him to act. The kingdom deserved better leadership, and David deserved to know the truth about his heritage, regardless of what he chose to do with that knowledge. The first step was to arrange a private meeting with David. Thomas called the young man's office, identifying himself as a former royal guard who had known David since childhood. He requested a personal meeting to discuss some family matters that had come to light after the Queen's death. David, curious and respectful of the older man's service, agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in the city. Thomas arrived early, choosing a corner table where they could speak without being overheard. His hands shook slightly as he arranged the manila folder containing copies of the crucial documents. After 43 years of keeping secrets, he was about to reveal the most significant one of his career. David entered the cafe precisely on time, his punctuality another small reminder of his royal breeding. He greeted Thomas warmly, though his expression showed polite confusion about the purpose of their meeting. Thomas had watched this young man grow up from a distance, but sitting across from him now, the resemblance to the Queen was unmistakable. Thomas began carefully, explaining his role in the royal household and his years of service to the Queen. He spoke about the trust that had been placed in him and the secrets he had been asked to keep. David listened intently, his intelligent eyes showing growing curiosity about where the conversation was leading. When Thomas finally revealed the truth about David's parentage, the young man's initial reaction was stunned silence. He stared at the documents Thomas placed before him, the birth certificate, the medical records, the photographs the Queen had secretly kept. David's face cycled through disbelief, shock, and finally a deep sadness that surprised Thomas. David's first words were not about the throne or his royal status, but about his adoptive parents. He asked whether they had known the truth, and when Thomas confirmed they had been keeping the secret on the Queen's orders, David's shoulders sagged with the weight of understanding how many people had been burdened by his existence. The revelation explained so many mysteries from David's childhood, the expensive educational opportunities that had seemed beyond his family's means, the way palace staff had always treated him with unusual warmth and respect, and the strange feeling he had always had that he somehow belonged in the grand halls of the royal residences. David examined the photographs with tears in his eyes, seeing his own face reflected in images of the Queen at various stages of her life. The resemblance was undeniable, but more than that, he could see shared expressions and gestures that he had unconsciously inherited. For the first time in his life, he understood where his mannerisms and instincts had come from. Thomas watched as David read the unsent letters from the Queen, letters filled with maternal love and profound regret. The young man wept quietly as he learned about the woman who had loved him from afar, who had sacrificed her happiness as a mother to protect both him and the monarchy. The depth of the Queen's sacrifice became clear as David absorbed the full story. The conversation lasted for hours as David asked question after question about his biological mother and the circumstances of his birth. Thomas answered as completely as he could, sharing memories of the Queen's subtle efforts to watch over David throughout his childhood. He described the pride in her eyes when she watched David excel in school, and the pain she carried when she couldn't publicly acknowledge his achievements. David struggled with feelings of anger and betrayal, not toward the Queen, but toward the circumstances that had forced such an impossible choice upon her. He understood intellectually why the secret had been necessary, but emotionally, he grieved for the relationship with his mother that he had never been allowed to have. The young man also grappled with the implications for his adoptive parents, who had raised him with genuine love despite knowing he was not their biological child. David realized they had made enormous sacrifices to give him a normal childhood, knowing that the truth would eventually come to light. Their love for him was proven not by biology, but by their willingness to protect him at personal cost. As the shock began to wear off, David started to consider the practical implications of Thomas's revelation. He was overwhelmed by the thought that he might have a legal claim to the throne, but he was also terrified by what that would mean for his carefully constructed life. The work he did helping refugees and displaced families gave his life meaning, and he couldn't imagine abandoning it for the ceremonial role of a monarch. Thomas assured David that there was no pressure to act on the information immediately. The secret had been kept for 28 years, and it could remain hidden until David decided what he wanted to do. However, Thomas also emphasized that David deserved to make that choice with full knowledge of his options and heritage. The meeting ended with David taking copies of all the documents Thomas had gathered. He needed time to process the information and decide what steps, if any, he wanted to take. Thomas gave David his contact information and promised to answer any additional questions that might arise as the young man came to terms with his true identity. As they parted ways, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The secret was finally shared, but now David faced the same burden of knowledge that had weighed on Thomas for so long. The older man hoped he had made the right choice in revealing the truth, but only time would tell how David would handle learning he was a hidden prince. The weeks following Thomas's revelation were the most difficult of David's life. He found himself unable to concentrate on his work, distracted by the constant awareness that everything he had believed about himself was fundamentally wrong. The documents Thomas had given him remained spread across his kitchen table, evidence of a truth so profound it seemed to reshape reality itself. David's first instinct was to confront his adoptive parents about their role in the deception. He drove to the estate on a Saturday morning, his mind churning with questions and emotions he couldn't fully process. The gardener and his wife welcomed him with their usual warmth, but David noticed new details in their behavior, the slight tension in their smiles, the way their eyes searched his face for signs of knowledge they feared he might possess. When David finally revealed what Thomas had told him, his adoptive mother broke down in tears. She had carried the burden of the secret for 28 years, watching David grow into a remarkable man while knowing she could never tell him the whole truth about his origins. His adoptive father sat in stunned silence, struggling with relief that the secret was finally out, and fear about what it might mean for their family. The three of them spent hours talking through the history David had never known. His adoptive parents revealed details about the Queen's private visits to check on his welfare, the careful arrangements made for his education, and the constant awareness that they were raising someone extraordinary who was destined for a life they could never fully prepare him for. David learned that his adoptive mother had often wondered if she was harming him by keeping the secret. She had watched him struggle with questions about his identity and heritage, knowing she had answers but being forbidden to share them. The Queen's death had intensified their dilemma, as they debated whether their oath of secrecy died with her. His adoptive father revealed that he had sometimes caught glimpses of the Queen watching David from her windows as he played in the gardens. The man had pretended not to notice, understanding that those stolen moments of maternal observation were precious to the monarch who couldn't publicly claim her son. The gardener had deliberately planned his work to give the Queen opportunities to see David without making their connection obvious. Through tears and embraces, David's adoptive family reaffirmed their love for him. They emphasized that regardless of his biological parentage, he would always be their son in every way that mattered. The revelation of his royal blood didn't diminish their bond, but rather highlighted the depth of their commitment to him throughout his life. David spent several days at the estate, walking the gardens where he had played as a child and trying to imagine his biological mother watching him from the palace windows. He visited the cottage where he had grown up, seeing it now through the lens of his new knowledge. The humble home felt different knowing it had been chosen specifically to hide a prince from the world. During his stay, David made a point of talking to longtime estate employees who had known him since childhood. Without revealing what he had learned, he asked about their memories of the Queen's interactions with his family. Several staff members mentioned the monarch's unusual interest in his welfare and education, details that now made perfect sense but had seemed merely kind at the time. David found himself studying portraits of the Queen throughout the palace, searching for resemblances and trying to understand the woman who had given birth to him. He read her public speeches with new eyes, looking for hints of the personal struggles she had faced while maintaining her public role. Her advocacy for children's welfare and family rights took on profound personal meaning. The young man also researched his biological father, the diplomat whose brief relationship with the Queen had resulted in his conception. David discovered that the man had been deeply involved in humanitarian work, dedicating his career to helping resolve international conflicts. The knowledge that both his biological parents had been committed to service helped David understand his own drive to help others. As David grappled with his identity crisis, he found himself questioning every aspect of his life. His career choice, his values, his relationships, everything felt uncertain when viewed through the lens of his royal heritage. He wondered whether his compassion and leadership abilities were genuine, parts of his character, or simply genetic inheritance from his royal bloodline. The pressure of the secret also began to affect David's personal relationships. His girlfriend noticed his distracted behavior and emotional distance, but David couldn't bring himself to share the truth. The weight of the revelation was too enormous to burden others with, yet keeping it to himself felt increasingly impossible. David sought counsel from a therapist, carefully describing his situation as learning about unexpected parentage without revealing the specific details of his royal connection. The professional helped him process the complex emotions surrounding identity, family loyalty, and the burden of life-changing secrets. Through therapy, David began to understand that his worth as a person wasn't determined by his bloodline, but by his actions and character. During this period of reflection, David also began to consider the broader implications of his discovery. He researched the current state of the monarchy, studying the heir apparent's public scandals and declining popularity ratings. The contrast between his own dedication to public service and the heir's self-indulgent lifestyle became impossible to ignore. David found himself imagining what kind of king he might become if he chose to reveal his identity and press his claim to the throne. His years of humanitarian work had given him deep insight into the struggles of ordinary people, knowledge that could inform compassionate leadership. However, the thought of abandoning his current mission to help refugees and displaced families felt like betraying his core values. 3 months after learning the truth about his parentage, David made a decision that would change everything. The current heir's latest scandal had dominated headlines for weeks. Financial improprieties and personal conduct that shocked even his harshest critics. Parliament was quietly discussing the possibility of passing over the heir in favor of someone more suitable, though no alternative candidate had emerged. David contacted Thomas and requested another meeting. This time he wanted to discuss the practical steps involved in revealing his identity to the world. The young man had spent countless sleepless nights weighing his options, and he had finally concluded that his duty to the country outweighed his personal desire for a quiet life. Thomas was both relieved and concerned by David's decision. He had hoped the young man would eventually choose to claim his birthright, but he also understood the enormous challenges that lay ahead. Together, they began planning how to present David's case in a way that would minimize chaos while establishing the legitimacy of his claim. The first step was to arrange for independent DNA testing to confirm David's parentage beyond any doubt. Thomas had preserved biological samples from the Queen's personal effects, and David provided his own sample for comparison. The testing was conducted by a laboratory known for handling sensitive royal matters, with results sealed pending David's decision about how to proceed. While waiting for the test results, David began preparing for the life-altering changes that would come with revealing his identity. He consulted with legal experts who specialized in constitutional law, learning about the complex process of establishing a claim to the throne. The lawyers confirmed that David's case was strong, particularly given the documented evidence of his birth and the Queen's acknowledgement of his parentage. David also sought advice from public relations specialists about managing the media storm that would inevitably follow his revelation. They warned him that his entire life would become public property, with journalists investigating every detail of his past and present. The contrast between his humble upbringing and royal blood would make for irresistible headlines. But the scrutiny would be intense and often hostile. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning, confirming what everyone already knew. David was indeed the biological son of the late Queen. The scientific evidence removed any remaining doubt about his claim, but it also made the decision to go public feel irreversible. There would be no going back to his anonymous life once the truth was revealed. David spent his final weeks of anonymity putting his affairs in order. He met with his supervisor at the aid organization to discuss transitioning his current projects to other staff members. He couldn't reveal the reason for his sudden departure, which made the conversations painful and awkward. His colleagues assumed he was leaving for a better position elsewhere, and David didn't correct their assumptions. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the refugee families he had been helping. These people had become like family to him, and David knew that once his royal identity was revealed, his ability to work directly with displaced populations would be severely limited. He promised to continue supporting their causes, but acknowledged that his role would have to change dramatically. David also prepared his girlfriend for the shock that was coming. Without revealing the specific details, he warned her that his life was about to change in ways that would affect their relationship. She was confused and hurt by his cryptic warnings, but David felt he couldn't burden her with the secret until after it became public knowledge. Thomas helped David prepare for the formal presentation of his case to royal officials and government representatives. They organized the evidence chronologically, prepared witness statements from surviving palace staff who remembered the Queen's pregnancy, and compiled a comprehensive dossier that told the complete story of David's hidden royal heritage. The plan was to first approach the Queen's private secretary and other senior royal officials with the evidence. If they accepted David's claim as legitimate, the information would then be presented to the Prime Minister and other key government figures. Only after the official channels had been informed would David consider making his identity public. David's adoptive parents were both supportive and terrified about their son's decision. They understood his sense of duty, but worried about the personal cost of claiming his birthright. The quiet life they had all enjoyed would be destroyed forever, replaced by constant public scrutiny and security concerns. As the date approached for David's first official meeting about his royal claim, he found himself thinking constantly about his biological mother. He wondered what advice the Queen would have given him if she had lived long enough to reveal the truth herself. The unsent letters suggested she had planned to tell him everything eventually, but would she have encouraged him to claim the throne? David also thought about the responsibility he would be accepting if his claim was recognized. The monarchy was facing its greatest crisis of legitimacy in modern history, with public support declining and calls for reform growing louder. As king, David would inherit not just a crown but also the challenge of proving the institution's continued relevance in the modern world. The young man's humanitarian background gave him a unique perspective on leadership that no previous monarch had possessed. His years working with refugees and displaced families had shown him the real-world impact of political decisions on ordinary people's lives. This experience could make him a more compassionate and effective ruler, but it also made him acutely aware of the weight of responsibility he would be accepting. On the eve of his first official meeting, David visited the Queen's grave for the first time since learning she was his mother. He stood silently before her headstone, trying to feel some connection to the woman who had given him life but never been able to claim him publicly. The conversation he wished he could have had with her would now have to happen in his imagination, but David hoped he was making choices that would honor her memory and sacrifice. The meeting that would change the course of British history took place on a crisp January morning in the private offices of Buckingham Palace. David arrived with Thomas, both men carrying the weight of a secret that had been hidden for nearly 3 decades. The Queen's former private secretary, Sir Edmund Harwell, greeted them with the measured politeness of someone who had no idea his world was about to be turned upside down. Sir Edmund's expression shifted from polite curiosity to stunned disbelief as Thomas presented the evidence of David's parentage. The DNA results, birth certificate, medical records, and the Queen's own letters created an irrefutable case that left the senior royal official speechless. For several long minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of an antique clock as Sir Edmund examined each document with growing amazement. The revelation explained numerous mysteries that had puzzled palace staff over the years. Sir Edmund himself remembered the Queen's unusual interest in the Gardiner's family and her insistence on personally overseeing the boy's education. Details that had seemed merely eccentric at the time now revealed themselves as the actions of a mother secretly caring for her hidden son. Word of David's claim spread quickly through the highest levels of government and the royal household. Emergency meetings were called as constitutional experts scrambled to understand the implications of a legitimate heir emerging after decades of secrecy. The current heir's reaction was predictably explosive when he learned that his position might be challenged by someone with a stronger claim to the throne. The Prime Minister's response was more measured but equally significant. The government had been quietly concerned about the current heir's fitness to rule, and David's emergence offered a potential solution to a growing constitutional crisis. However, the political implications of changing the line of succession were enormous and would require careful handling. Meanwhile, David found himself at the center of a media storm unlike anything he could have imagined. News of the hidden prince leaked within days of the official meetings, and journalists descended on his life like locusts. Every detail of his background was scrutinized, from his humanitarian work to his modest lifestyle. The contrast between his character and that of the current heir became a constant theme in the coverage. Public reaction was overwhelmingly positive toward David personally, but divided on the question of succession. Many people were charmed by the story of the humanitarian who had been raised in obscurity, seeing him as a refreshing alternative to the scandal-plagued heir. Others worried about the precedent of changing succession based on personal character rather than established law. David's adoptive parents found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight as journalists sought details about his upbringing. The elderly couple handled the attention with dignity, emphasizing David's good character while refusing to discuss private family matters. Their obvious love for their son touched the public and added to the positive narrative surrounding David's story. The legal challenges were complex but ultimately favorable to David's case. Constitutional experts confirmed that his biological parentage gave him a legitimate claim to the throne, particularly given the documented evidence of the Queen's acknowledgement. The fact that she had never formally renounced him as her heir strengthened his position considerably. Thomas found himself hailed as a hero by some and criticized as a traitor by others. His decision to reveal the secret after the Queen's death was seen either as honoring her memory or betraying her trust, depending on one's perspective. The old guardsman maintained that he had acted in the best interests of both David and the country. Believing that the truth needed to be told, Parliament faced the unprecedented task of deciding between competing claims to the throne. The current heir's supporters argued that changing the succession would set a dangerous precedent and undermine the stability of the monarchy. David's advocates countered that the institution needed renewal and that his character and experience made him the better choice for modern Britain. David himself handled the pressure with remarkable grace, drawing on his experience dealing with complex international situations during his humanitarian work. He spoke publicly about his commitment to service while acknowledging the difficult personal journey of learning about his true parentage. His genuine humility and obvious competence impressed both politicians and the general public. The crisis reached its resolution when the current heir, facing overwhelming pressure and recognizing the strength of David's claim, voluntarily renounced his rights to the throne. In a statement that surprised many, he acknowledged that David's character and dedication to public service made him the better choice to lead the country into the future. David's coronation took place on a bright spring morning, exactly 1 year after Thomas had first revealed the truth about his parentage. The ceremony blended traditional elements with innovations that reflected the new king's commitment to making the monarchy more relevant to ordinary people. Representatives from refugee organizations and humanitarian groups were given prominent places, symbolizing David's intention to use his position to advance social justice. In his first speech as king, David paid tribute to his adoptive parents, to Thomas for his courage in revealing the truth, and most importantly, to the mother he had never known but who had loved him from afar. He promised to honor her memory by serving the country with the same dedication she had shown, while bringing his own experience and perspective to the ancient institution of monarchy. The transformation from hidden prince to king was complete, but David never forgot the lessons learned during his years of anonymity. He continued to champion the causes of refugees and displaced families, using his royal platform to bring attention to humanitarian crises around the world. The man who had been raised as a gardener's son became a king who truly understood the struggles of ordinary people. Thomas watched the coronation from a place of honor, finally able to speak openly about the secret he had carried for so long. The burden that had weighed on him for decades was lifted, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing he had helped reveal a truth that would benefit both David and the country. The hidden prince had become a king worthy of the crown, proving that sometimes the greatest leaders emerge from the most unexpected places.